At his own brother's funeral, Jordan Monroe wasn't just grieving. He was arrested thanks to a false report from HOA President Karen Holloway. For years, she used her power to control, intimidate, and punish those she deemed unfit for her neighborhood, and this time, she wanted to make a statement. But there was one thing she didn't count on. Jordan's father was the U.S. Attorney General, and just wait until you hear how one phone call turned Karen's world upside down and why justice finally hit back. David Monroe had buried his son that morning. The weight of it pressed down on him like the sky had collapsed, crushing him under its weight. His breath came slow and deliberate, as if forcing himself to inhale was the only way to keep standing. The cold from the damp ground seeped into his shoes, but he didn't move. He couldn't. His body felt like it wasn't his anymore, just an empty shell left behind to witness this final moment. The casket lowered inch by inch, the black lacquered wood gleaming under the dull gray sky. The ropes strained under its weight, the pulleys groaning softly, and each sound was another cut against his already raw soul. The scent of fresh dirt, sharp and earthy, mixed with the sickly sweet aroma of funeral lilies. The air was thick with sorrow, heavy enough to choke on. Beside him, Jordan stood rigid, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles were bone white. His chest rose and fell in sharp bursts, his shoulders trembling just enough to be noticeable. His face, so much like his brother's, was twisted in an expression that hovered somewhere between unbearable pain and barely restrained rage. His eyes burned, dark, wild, full of the kind of grief that had nowhere to go but inward, eating him alive from the inside. David wanted to reach for him, to place a steadying hand on his shoulder, to do something, anything, to ease his son's suffering. But he didn't. He couldn't. What comfort could he possibly offer when his own grief felt like an open wound that would never heal, when his eldest son, his firstborn, was gone forever? Then she appeared. Like a storm rolling in, her presence disrupted everything. Karen Holloway, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, the woman who had made it her life's mission to police every little thing that didn't fit her narrow idea of acceptable. She was dressed in her usual perfection, an expensive beige coat, spotless despite the damp cemetery grounds, her blonde hair cut into a sharp bob that framed her face in a way that was meant to look effortless, but screamed money and privilege. Her surgically arched brows knitted together in a look of exaggerated concern, her lips pursed like she was doing everyone a favor just by existing. And behind her, like two guard dogs waiting for a command, stood two uniformed officers, their expressions unreadable. The second David saw them, a dark, ugly feeling coiled in his gut. Karen wasn't here to mourn. She wasn't here out of respect. No, she had come for something else, and whatever it wasn't good. "There he is," she said, her voice ringing through the cemetery, slicing through the thick silence like a knife. Her manicured finger pointed directly at Jordan. David felt his breath hitch. "That's him," she continued louder now, full of righteous indignation. "He's trespassing. He doesn't even live here anymore. Arrest him." For a split second, there was nothing, no reaction, just stunned silence. It was as if the entire funeral, the entire world had paused, trying to process the insanity of what had just been said. Then it all unraveled. Jordan's head snapped toward her, his grief-dulled eyes instantly sharpening into fury. His lips parted, but whatever words he wanted to say got lost in the chaos that exploded around them. David's chest burned with something that had nothing to do with grief. His pain morphed into something else entirely, something razor-sharp and violent. His muscles tensed, his jaw locked so tight it ached. The sound of his own heartbeat thundered in his ears. A murmur of confusion rippled through the gathered mourners before giving way to shouts of outrage. "What the hell is this? Are you serious? She can't be doing this." But Karen stood firm, arms crossed, her chin tilted up just slightly, a self-satisfied glint in her eye. She had come here to make a statement, to remind everyone exactly who held the power in this community. And now, as two uniformed men advanced toward Jordan, she was reveling in it. David took a step forward, but before he could speak, one of the officers was already talking. "Sir," he said, voice flat, professional, the kind of tone that meant he didn't really care about the situation. He was just following orders. "You need to come with us." Jordan let out a harsh, humorless laugh, but it was laced with something dangerous. His fists, already clenched, tightened even more. His whole body was coiled, like a wire pulled too tight, ready to snap. "Are you kidding me?" Jordan's voice was raw, disbelief dripping from every word. "This is my brother's funeral." The officer hesitated, just for a second. Just enough for David to catch it. Just enough for him to realize that maybe, just maybe, even the police knew how wrong this was. But it didn't matter. Karen had spoken. And in this neighborhood, Karen's words were law. David moved again, stepping toward them, his hands shaking with barely restrained fury. His grief had been bad enough, an unbearable, crushing thing that left him hollow and raw. But this was something else entirely. This was humiliation. This was an attack on his son, on his family. This was personal. Before he could reach Jordan, a firm grip locked around his arm, his brother. A silent warning. Not now, not here, not yet. But the fire inside him roared to life. The officers closed in, one reaching for Jordan's wrist. And then, chaos. Jordan struggled, his voice rising with a mix of rage and desperation. His body jerked as he tried to twist out of their grasp, but they were faster, stronger, and before he could even process what was happening, the sharp, metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the cemetery. Gasps, shouts, a scream from somewhere in the crowd. David's hands balled into fists as he watched, powerless, as his only surviving child was wrenched away from his side. Jordan's eyes met his father's, wild with disbelief, pleading for something, anything, that would make this stop. But it didn't stop. It only got worse. The officers turned, dragging him toward their car, boots crunching over damp grass, their uniforms stark against the muted grays of the cemetery. David could do nothing. Not yet. And Karen? She stood there, arms folded, watching it all unfold with that same self-satisfied expression. Then, just for a second, her lips curled at the edges, the smallest smirk, and that was when David knew. This wasn't about rules. This wasn't about the HOA. This was about control, and Karen Holloway had just declared war on the wrong family. Karen Holloway had always been a menace, a tyrant wrapped in designer clothes, moving through the neighborhood like a self-proclaimed queen, issuing rules and dictating who belonged and who didn't. She was the type of woman who wielded power not through respect, but through relentless control, the kind of person who believed that property lines defined worth, that bylaws were weapons, and that the world was a better place when she was the one running it. It wasn't enough for her to be president of the Homeowners Association. She treated it like a throne. She relished the role, thrived on it, lived for the power trip that came with monitoring lawns, handing out fines, and sending passive-aggressive emails laced with faux politeness and legal jargon. She knew every code, every restriction, every loophole, and she used them like a surgeon's scalpel, cutting down anyone who didn't fit her perfectly curated, lily-white version of the community. But this was a new level of cruel. Not even Karen, with her rigid obsession over neighborhood aesthetics and bylaws, had ever stooped this low before. The official reason for calling the police? The HOA had rules she loved to quote whenever it suited her. One of them, buried deep in the fine print of a document no sane person actually read, stated that non-residents weren't allowed at private community events without prior approval. To Karen, a funeral, even one held at a public cemetery, apparently counted as a private community event, and Jordan, though born and raised in that neighborhood, no longer technically lived there. That, in her mind, made him an outsider, a trespasser, someone who didn't belong. But the truth was much pettier, much uglier. Karen had held a grudge against Jordan for years. It had started at a community meeting, one of those suffocating gatherings in the HOA clubhouses where homeowners sat on stiff-back chairs while Karen droned on about fence heights, mailbox colors, and garbage bin placement. She had been in the middle of discussing safety concerns when Jordan, just a teenager then, had stood up and called her out. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't cursed. He had simply pointed out what everyone else was too afraid to say. That Karen didn't seem to have a problem when white teenagers loitered at the park after dark. But when black kids who lived in the neighborhood, did the same, suddenly it was an issue. The room had gone quiet. Karen had smiled. Tight, controlled, but her eyes had burned with something far more dangerous than simple embarrassment. She never forgot, never forgave. Years passed, but for Karen, that moment was carved into stone. It festered, grew. Jordan had publicly defied her, had challenged her authority in her own domain. That was something she simply could not let go. So when she saw him at the funeral, his own brother's funeral, she didn't see a grieving man saying goodbye to his sibling. She saw an opportunity, a way to put him back in his place, a way to remind him who really ran things. Karen wasn't stupid. She knew exactly how to play the system. She didn't have to shout racial slurs to be racist. She didn't have to use explicit language to exert control. No, she was far more subtle than that. She understood that power wasn't just about rules, it was about who had the authority to enforce them. And in that moment, she did. Because some people wore a badge but had no spine. Because there were always officers who saw a white woman pointing at a black man and immediately assumed she was the victim. Because when Karen, with her perfectly rehearsed tone of outrage and her calculated distress, told them that Jordan was trespassing, they didn't hesitate. They didn't ask questions. They didn't stop to consider the context, to think for themselves, to look around and realize that they were about to arrest a man at his brother's funeral. They just listened. Because people like Karen always knew exactly what words to say to get what they wanted. And that day, she wanted Jordan in cuffs. David Monroe stormed into the police station, a force of barely restrained fury wrapped in a tailored black suit. The room seemed to shift under the weight of his presence. Every step he took echoed with a controlled, deliberate intensity, his polished dress shoes striking the scuffed linoleum floor like the ticking of a bomb about to detonate. The front desk officer barely glanced up, his disinterest palpable. The kind of bureaucratic apathy that had let too many people like Jordan slip through the cracks, swallowed whole by a system designed to grind them down. The air in the station smelled of stale coffee, ink, and the faint metallic tang of desperation. The scent of a place that had held far too many people who never should have been there in the first place. David's eyes scanned the holding area, sharp and unyielding, until they landed on his son. Jordan was sitting on a metal bench behind the bars, his hands resting loosely between his knees. He wasn't slouched, but he wasn't tense either. He sat with the kind of exhausted stillness that spoke of a man who had been through this before, who had learned that no matter how loudly he protested, no matter how many times he said, "I didn't do anything," it wouldn't matter. His jaw was clenched, his lips pressed into a thin line. His face, so much like his mother's, was carefully blank, but his eyes told another story, a story of quiet, simmering rage, of exhaustion that came not just from this night, but from a lifetime of being treated like a criminal for the simple crime of existing in his own skin. David's breath came slow and deep, his heartbeat a steady, measured drumbeat beneath his ribs. He wouldn't raise his voice. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing emotion spill over. No, this required something far more dangerous than anger, cold, calculated. Power. "We're processing him for trespassing and disorderly conduct," the desk officer droned, still not bothering to look up from his paperwork. His voice was the kind of monotone that came from repetition, from doing the same thing so many times that it had lost all meaning. Jordan was just another case number, another name in a file. David didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch, let the weight of it settle over the room. Then, with meticulous control, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. Slow, deliberate. He flipped it open, extracted a single card, and placed it on the desk with a quiet snick of leather against wood. The movement was unassuming, but the effect was instant. The officer's eyes flicked down, intending to give it nothing more than a cursory glance. And then, stillness. A shift in the air. The color drained from the man's face as recognition slammed into him like a freight train. His posture stiffened, his fingers twitching slightly, as if he'd just realized he had been playing a very, very dangerous game without knowing the stakes. U.S. Attorney General David Monroe, not just a lawyer, not just a judge, the highest-ranking law enforcement official in the entire country. The officer's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed, his hand tightening slightly around the pen he was holding. He finally looked up, meeting David's gaze for the first time, and what he saw there made him visibly uncomfortable. David didn't blink, didn't flinch. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm, controlled, lethal. Release him, now. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order, one that would be followed. Immediately, or there would be consequences that this officer and his entire department would not be prepared to handle. Karen Holloway sat comfortably in her HOA office, the picture of smug satisfaction. Her freshly manicured nails clicked rhythmically against the smooth mahogany desk as she flipped through a stack of violation notices, each one a small victory in her ongoing crusade to maintain order in the neighborhood. The office smelled of expensive candles, something floral and artificial, meant to exude sophistication, but instead reeked of the same forced perfection she demanded from everyone around her. Everything was as it should be. Jordan Monroe had been put in his place. The funeral fiasco had been handled. And best of all, she had reminded the entire community that her authority was absolute. The rules mattered. She mattered. Her cell phone rang, an unfamiliar number flashing on the screen. Karen picked it up without a second thought, barely pausing in her review of a particularly egregious violation. Someone had dared to install a basketball hoop in their driveway. She would be handling that. "Karen Holloway?" she answered, her tone clipped, professional. A brief pause, then a voice, deep, measured, lethal in its quiet precision. "This is David Monroe." The pen in Karen's hand slipped, rolling off the desk and landing with a soft clink on the hardwood floor. She didn't move. For a second, her mind struggled to process what she had just heard, as if the name had no business coming from the other end of her phone. The words seemed to warp the air around her, sucking out the artificial warmth of her office and replacing it with something cold. David Monroe. Her breath caught. The Attorney General. Her grip on the phone tightened, her fingers curling around it as if it might somehow steady her. "The same," he confirmed, his voice devoid of any warmth, stripped of anything but pure, unyielding steel. Karen swallowed, suddenly acutely aware of the sound of her own heartbeat. She had known David Monroe was an attorney. His name had come up in HOA dealings before, usually when she was trying to find some obscure clause to use against him, but she had never thought much of it. He was just another homeowner who thought he was above the rules. Except he wasn't just a homeowner, and he wasn't just an attorney. He was the Attorney General of the United States. And now he was calling her. "I strongly suggest you get yourself a lawyer, Miss Holloway." His words were slow, deliberate, each one a carefully placed threat disguised as legal advice. "Because by the end of this week, you'll be facing charges for filing a false police report, harassment, and discrimination." Karen's mouth went dry. She parted her lips to respond, to argue, to do something, but nothing came out. The weight of what he had just said settled onto her shoulders like a collapsing ceiling. False police report, harassment, discrimination. Her mind raced, trying to untangle the implications, to calculate the damage, to figure out if there was some way, any way, to twist this in her favor. But there wasn't, because this wasn't some petty HOA dispute. This wasn't a parking violation or an unapproved mailbox or a noise complaint she could bury in paperwork. This was federal. This was criminal. And for the first time in a very, very long time, Karen Holloway was not in control. David wasn't bluffing. The moment he walked out of that police station with Jordan by his side, the wheels of justice had already begun to turn. Unlike Karen Holloway, he didn't need to scream or throw tantrums to wield power. His authority wasn't built on empty threats and petty rulebooks. It was carved into the very foundation of the legal system. And now, that system was coming for her. Within days, the subpoenas started rolling in. First, they hit the HOA board. Men and women who had once cowered under Karen's rule, who had nodded along as she steamrolled over homeowners, suddenly found themselves sitting in stiff-backed chairs across from federal investigators. They weren't just being asked about this incident. No, David was thorough. His team had spent the last 48 hours combing through every document, every meeting transcript, every complaint filed under Karen's watch. And what they found? It was ugly. Karen's paper trail was longer than anyone had realized. The minor infractions, the violations, disproportionately handed out to Black and Latino residents, the fines, the evictions, each one had seemed small on its own. Just a rule here, a penalty there. But when put together, it was a pattern, a very damning pattern. And then came the testimonies. Former residents, people who had moved out years ago, thinking they had escaped her reign, were coming forward. Social media exploded with stories. Karen Holloway fined my grandmother $500 because her curtains were too dark. She cried for days. My husband was forced to take down a basketball hoop, but the White family 2 houses down had one for years. When we pointed it out, she ignored us. She called the cops on my teenage son for sitting in his own car, said he looked suspicious. One after another, the accusations piled up. And Jordan was gearing up to sue. His name was on a lawsuit that was about to shake the HOA to its core. False imprisonment, emotional distress, civil rights violations. And Karen? Karen was the defendant. Her name, once synonymous with power in the neighborhood, was now a legal liability. The media caught wind of it, and the story spread like wildfire. Local news stations ran segments with outraged anchors shaking their heads. HOA president calls cops on mourner at his own brother's funeral was too juicy a headline to ignore, and when the footage leaked, the grainy but unmistakable video of Jordan being handcuffed in front of his brother's grave, it was over. Karen's once flawless reputation was now a wreckage of court documents and public outrage. And the officers who had so eagerly slapped cuffs on Jordan, they weren't safe either. They sat in a courtroom, shifting uncomfortably as a judge stared them down. Their usual bravado, the easy confidence of men who had always believed they could act without consequences, had vanished. Because now, they weren't just police officers, they were defendants in a civil rights case. "Can you explain," the judge asked, his voice razor sharp, "why you arrested a man at his brother's funeral when he had committed no crime?" The silence in that courtroom was suffocating. Karen's world was crumbling, and for the first time, there was no HOA rule, no fine, no police call that could save her. The news broke fast, faster than Karen Holloway could have ever anticipated. 1 minute, she was still trying to salvage her crumbling authority, scrambling to regain control of the situation, reassuring herself that this was just a misunderstanding, just another HOA dispute blown out of proportion. The next, her name was everywhere. HOA president arrests man at brother's funeral, then learns his father is the attorney general. The headline exploded across news sites, social media feeds, and television broadcasts, spreading like wildfire. It wasn't just a local story anymore. It wasn't just angry neighbors gossiping in Facebook groups. This was national. The details were damning. A grieving man arrested at his own brother's funeral, a power-hungry HOA president, a father who just so happened to be the most powerful law enforcement official in the country. It was the kind of story that people loved to hate, the kind of scandal that turned into a viral sensation overnight. And Karen was the villain. Social media erupted. Twitter, Reddit, Instagram. Every platform became a battleground of outrage and mockery. #Karen started trending within hours. Imagine ruining a funeral because you thought your HOA bylaws were the Constitution. This woman really woke up and chose to let me go to jail for being racist today. She had the audacity to arrest the attorney general's son. That's next level delusion. The memes came next. Karen's smug HOA photo was photoshopped onto mugshots, onto historical images of dictators, onto posters for crime documentaries. Someone dug up her old Facebook posts, passive-aggressive complaints about certain types of people in the neighborhood, and those went viral too. Her reputation wasn't just in freefall. It had been thrown off a cliff and set on fire. And then, the real fallout began. HOA board members started resigning one by one. Some did it quietly, slipping away before the media could track them down. Others released statements full of empty excuses. We had no idea Karen was capable of such behavior, as if they hadn't spent years nodding along to her every rule, every fine, every whispered complaint about community standards. But it wasn't enough. Nothing could stop the avalanche that was coming. Because then, the final blow landed. David Monroe himself stepped in. He didn't just let the scandal play out in the court of public opinion, he escalated it. He personally filed a civil rights lawsuit against the HOA, not just against Karen, but the entire organization that had enabled her. It was no longer just about Jordan's wrongful arrest. It was about the years of systemic discrimination, the pattern of abuse, the documented harassment of Black and Latino homeowners under Karen's rule. And this time, the Justice Department was involved. Karen wasn't facing a slap on the wrist. She wasn't facing a fine. She was facing federal charges. Her world wasn't just crumbling, it was collapsing. And for the first time, there was no loophole, no HOA bylaw, no carefully worded excuse that could save her. Karen did what all people like her do when they get caught. She played the victim. The moment she realized there was no way out, that her power was slipping through her fingers like sand, she did what every self-righteous tyrant does when the world finally holds them accountable. She rewrote the narrative. First, there were the tears. She sat under the bright studio lights of the local news station, her carefully styled bob a little less perfect, her usual sharpness dulled by manufactured sorrow. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her voice trembling just enough to sound fragile. The reporter, maintaining a neutral expression, nodded along as she delivered her heartfelt apology. "This has all been such a misunderstanding," she sniffled. "I was misled. I was told that there was a security issue, and I was just following protocol. I never meant for this to happen. My heart breaks for the Monroe family." The camera zoomed in on her face, capturing the practiced quiver of her lip, the glistening tear that slid down her cheek at just the right moment. She blamed miscommunication. She blamed bad information. She blamed the officers. She blamed the HOA rules. She blamed everyone and everything, except herself. But no one was buying it. Not this time. The public had seen the video. They had read the lawsuits. They had watched her smirk at the funeral while Jordan was dragged away in cuffs. They had heard the stories from former residents, the people who had endured years of her selective enforcement, her targeted fines, her abuse of power. And now? Now they were watching her squirm. The internet had turned her name into a cautionary tale. Don't be a Karen Holloway. HOA boards across the country were being flooded with demands to prevent their Karens from ever gaining the kind of unchecked power she had wielded for so long. Then came the real reckoning. The courtroom was packed the day of the ruling. Journalists filled the benches, their cameras clicking as Jordan Monroe sat across from Karen, his expression unreadable. David Monroe sat beside him, silent, a force of pure, unshakable authority. He didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The weight of justice was already pressing down on Karen like an anvil, suffocating, inescapable. The judge didn't drag it out. Karen had tried to play the victim, but the evidence spoke louder than her crocodile tears. The ruling was clear. Jordan won. The settlement was hefty, not just for Jordan, but for the countless victims of Karen's tenure as HOA president. The numbers weren't just a financial loss. They were a statement, a punishment, a warning. The HOA was forced to rewrite its policies from the ground up. No more unchecked power, no more arbitrary fines, no more racially motivated complaints disguised as community concerns. Karen's reign had exposed too many cracks in the system, and now those cracks were being sealed. Permanently. And Karen, she lost everything. Her job, her reputation, her social circle. Neighbors who once feared her now openly mocked her. The people she had lorded over for years no longer averted their eyes when she passed. They laughed. Her home, the house she had fought so hard to maintain under her rules, was now in foreclosure. The legal fees had swallowed her whole. The settlement had drained what little savings she had left. No more power, no more control. Just silence. Just irrelevance. And for someone like Karen Holloway, that was the worst punishment of all. Jordan stood outside the courthouse, free, victorious. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps, the light reflecting off the sea of cameras and microphones shoved in his direction. Reporters shouted over each other, desperate to capture his first words post-trial. "Jordan, how does it feel to win? Do you think this case will change HOA policies nationwide? What do you have to say to Karen Holloway?" The questions came rapid fire, but he barely heard them. The world buzzed around him. Flashes, voices, movement. But his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about his brother. The last time he had stood outside a courthouse, it had been for the sentencing of the drunk driver who had killed him. That day had been nothing but raw pain. Nothing but fists clenched in his pockets, and tears he refused to let fall. That day he had walked out feeling empty. But today was different. Justice had been served, not just for himself, but for everyone Karen had wronged, everyone she had targeted, fined, humiliated. The woman who had called the cops on him at his own brother's funeral was now a pariah. She had been stripped of her power, forced to answer for every abuse she had inflicted over the years. And yet, none of that was what really mattered. He would have given up every headline, every dollar from the settlement, every moment of vindication, if it meant his brother was still here. David Monroe stood beside him, solid as ever, the weight of a lifetime of battles settled in his shoulders. His father had seen injustices that stretched far beyond this one, had fought wars in courtrooms and legislatures long before Jordan had even been born. And yet, today, there was something in his eyes, something rare, and pride. David placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder, the grip steady, grounding. "He'd be proud of you." The words hit deep, cutting through the noise, the chaos, the residual anger that still simmered under Jordan's skin. His throat tightened, but he exhaled through it, a slow, measured breath. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice quieter than the cameras would catch. "I think so." He didn't need to say more, because his father already knew. Because his brother, wherever he was, already knew too. And as they turned, stepping away from the flashing cameras and the rabid press, they walked as free men, unbroken, stronger than before. Meanwhile, across town, Karen Holloway sat alone in her empty house. The silence was suffocating. Once, this place had been her kingdom. The house, with its pristine white shutters and immaculately trimmed hedges, had been a reflection of her control over the neighborhood. Every blade of grass, every porch light, every mailbox had been under her authority. But now it was a tomb. The HOA board had replaced her. The lawsuit had bankrupted her. The friends who had once admired her authority now pretended they had never known her at all. She had built her life on rules, on power, on keeping people like Jordan Monroe in their place. And now she had nothing. Her perfectly arranged furniture, her designer curtains, her meticulously curated world, it all felt hollow. Because what was power without people to control? What was a kingdom without subjects? Through the window, she could see a moving truck parked in a driveway down the street. A new family was moving in, black, young, full of life. Once upon a time, she would have found a way to keep them out. Now she could only watch, as her empire of control and cruelty turned to dust.